Okay, this is English 373, week 5, part 6. I'm only just gonna do I'm gonna do a little bit more. I went a little long last week and I got some clips I wanted you to see this week. So I'm not gonna do this is gonna be a shorter week. I just want to kind of introduce Coriolanus sort of briefly. I want to say something about time really quick. Um, I mean historical sort of time. It's I think my students have this idea of history as being like 100 years, right? There was like there was the internet got invented, and then before that you got guns, and before that you got airplanes, and then before that they had some guns and right cars, and then before that it's all swords and horses. It's all swords and sandals and horses and castles. Um, it's worth pointing out that like when you hear the word king, you tend to picture like a kind of beautiful palace with gold, beautiful big mirrors with gold on the edges, and these beautiful flowing robes covered in gold and the jewel encrusted crowns and stuff. That's what you picture when you hear the word king. What you're picturing there is France in the 1700s, or France in the 1800s. France in the 1700s. You're picturing France in the 1700s. Um, it's worth pointing out that Shakespeare was like 100 years before that, but and they had they had a lot of jewel encrusted stuff in the 1600s, but Macbeth is from the 1200s, and it's definitely more like it's more like warring tribes. Like they're not. In fact, Orson Welles' Macbeth, which is entirely available if you want to watch it. The whole thing's for free on YouTube. I may link to it. It's a little much to ask students to do both Shakespeare and Orson Welles at the same time, but it is free on YouTube, and I love it. But he does Macbeth, and it's like they're barbarians living in caves, and people don't like that movie, but I think it's fucking rad. I'm a sucker for Orson Welles because I think Orson Welles is fucking cool. Um, so this is extra important when we get to Coriolanus. So obviously we live in the 2000s, and Coriolanus and Shakespeare lived 400 years ago. Macbeth was a real person who lived 400 years before Shakespeare in 1200. Our next play, written by Shakespeare, we're going to go over, is called Coriolanus. Now, Macbeth is one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, partly because it's one of Shakespeare's shortest plays, and it's extremely good, which makes it real teachable because it's short and awesome. Coriolanus is one of Shakespeare's longest plays, and nobody likes Coriolanus but me. The only people that like Coriolanus are me and Ray Fiennes, who you may know as Voldemort. But we are the only two that like that. Um, but I think it is a hidden gem, and I think it's an amazing play. Also, it's one of my favorite movies, one of my favorite Shakespeare movies. And you guys get to see three Shakespeare movies in this class that are my three favorite Shakespeare movies. You saw the Macbeth one, which is really cool. One of the reasons I teach Coriolanus is because there's a movie version of Coriolanus, and it's fucking rad. It might be one of my favorite Shakespeare movies, and I have seen 100 of them. The movie um, well, let me tell you about the play first before I tell the movie. So the play, we live in the 2000s. Shakespeare lives in this. We lived in it. We live in New York in the 2000s. Shakespeare lived in England in 1600. Macbeth lived in Scotland in 1200. Coriolanus lives in ancient Rome in 500 BC. So Coriolanus is 500 years before the birth of Christ. Coriolanus is happening around the time that he's like 100 years before Plato. Coriolanus is roughly the same time as like the Battle of Thermopylae, which my students all know from the movie 300. So Coriolanus is old. It is ancient shit. Shakespeare has several plays that are set in the ancient, because also students tend to be like, they get very confused about the word ancient. Um, the idea is that like, so Shakespeare lived in the Renaissance, it was called. But when you talk about the ancient world, you're talking about Rome and Greece, kind of before Christ or just after Christ. That's your ancient world. That's what when you say the ancient world, that's what you're referring to. Coriolanus really lives in the ancient world, and some of my students feel like 1980 is the ancient world, and some of my students feel like 1600 is the ancient world. But 500 BC. 500 years before Christ, during Plato's time and the Battle of Thermopylae, that's old. Although, anybody from Iraq would be like, that's not old, because they got older shit than that. It's all relative. Like Americans think Americans think something 100 years old is old, and British people think something 1,000 years old is old, and Greeks think something 2,000, 3,000 years old is old. You go to Egypt and shit. Um, okay, anyway, so it's important to understand that Coriolanus is taking place in a very different time and place. And it's confusing for students, I think, because they have an instinct that because Shakespeare lived in England, all of his plays, because Shakespeare lived in England around 1600, the plays all sort of take place in England around the year 1600, which is not right. Some of them do, but a lot of them don't. Shakespeare actually wrote 4 plays about the ancient world. He's got Julius Caesar, which is often taught in high school. I quite like Julius Caesar. I think it's a good play. He's got Antony and Cleopatra, which is one of his best plays, very rarely taught. There's not really a good movie version of either of those two. Um, he has Timon of Athens, which everybody hates, and I think they're right to. I fucking hate that play. It's terrible. Don't read it. And then he has Coriolanus. I might be missing one. Anyway, I think that's basically his ancient world plays. Um, I guess Midsummer Night's Dream is also the ancient world, but it's so magic-y, it doesn't feel like it takes place in any time. Um, okay, Midsummer Night's Dream is more like mythological. Coriolanus, like Macbeth, was a real person who lived. Um, Interestingly, you will discover. Remember when Macbeth compared himself to Tarquin, the ancient Roman rapist? Coriolanus was part of Coriolanus murdered that dude. Um, they're gonna mention that later on in the play. Um, so there's a movie version of Coriolanus. Now the movie version tries to modernize it. So the movie version is set in some kind of modern day war in Eastern Europe. Um, it's filmed in Eastern Europe, and they use it as a stand-in for a kind of fictionalized Rome. But it's like machine guns and soldiers dressed in modern military gear. And so, because honestly, it's a cheaper way to film the movie, right? If you have to make something look like ancient Rome, that's going to be expensive. But if you want to fly to Eastern Europe and get a bunch of prop guns, you can film the movie easier. The movie is interesting because it is directed by and stars as Coriolanus, Ray Fiennes, who most people know from he plays Voldemort. But I did not give a shit about Coriolanus until I saw this movie, and I was like, "Holy shit, this movie is rad!" It's also got Jessica Chastain, and it's got Vanessa Redgrave, who's cool. You will also see Black Panther's dad shows up as the leader of the military forces. I don't know, it's a cool movie. Um, but it sort of modernizes everything. Now the language is still Shakespeare's. Every word they say in the play is Shakespeare's, and they've cut a lot out, and they've rearranged some stuff, and they've added in some things. So there's a character named Menenius who in the play doesn't do in the movie he commits suicide. He does not commit suicide in the play. They just wanted to make it a little more dramatic, so they had him slit his wrists. The enemy of Coriolanus is named Aufidius and is played by Gerard Butler, who my students know from Law Abiding Citizen, and he was in 300. And I don't always love Gerard Butler, but he's really good in this movie. I feel like Gerard Butler is often in piece of shit movies, but this is a pretty cool movie. I don't know. I was very impressed with it. Let's see. What else do I want to say by way of introduction? Yeah, I don't know. So that's the movie. You should go rent it. Go get it somewhere. I was sort of hesitant. I'm realizing now, I'm not making you buy a book, so you can rent 3 movies. It'll cost $2-3 each. And I think that's reasonable considering and I'm not making you buy a book. You don't even have to pay for subways to come into to school. Just grab 3 movies for rent them for $3 each on Amazon or whatever, YouTube or Google Play. Or I'm not telling you to illegally download them. That would be wrong if you were to go to a website and illegally download something so that you could save money and still learn something. I didn't tell you to do that. Yeah, so and it's only 3 movies because Leonardo DiCaprio's Romeo and Juliet, Ray Fiennes is Coriolanus, and Michael Fassbender's Macbeth. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.